We have a decision that was made by the grand jury, which was December 2014 grand jury. They started on December 1st. I'd first like to give my thanks to this grand jury. They took their job seriously throughout their term of service, and in particular this case. After many long hours of listening to evidence, questioning witnesses, and after a lot of deliberation, they made a decision. Briefly, let me give you a process. I chose to present this case of an officer-involved shooting to the grand jury and allow them to exercise their civil powers for the purpose of transparency. Events have occurred across the United States that have caused me to pause and reflect on how certain cases should proceed. Asking the grand jury to issue a general presentment allowed us to have a court reporter present who recorded the testimony that was presented to the grand jury, and it also allowed the grand jury to explain how they came to their decision. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation submitted a file to our office in the latter part of December of 2014. The file contained over 2,500 pages of investigation. That number does not include the audio recordings and the tape statements that they obtained from witnesses. Since the grand jury convened last Thursday, February 19, 2015, 45 witnesses were presented to the grand jury. Several witnesses were called back by the grand jury for additional testimony. Witnesses included law enforcement officers, forensic experts, and civilians. Multiple civilian witnesses, some provided by the Smith family, who were personally served a subpoena, failed to show for grand jury. Despite their absence, their audio recorded statements were played to the grand jury. We had several civilian witnesses who avoided being served with a subpoena despite numerous efforts by the investigators with the district attorney's office. They went by in the morning, they went by in the afternoon, they went by at night, they also went by on the weekend. We knew that they were avoiding subpoenas. Despite their absence, their audio recorded statements were played for the grand jury. Officer Jannot and the attorney for the Smith family have been notified of the grand jury's decision today. The grand jury issued a general presentment today and found that Officer Jannot with the Savannah-Chatham Metropolitan Police Department used justifiable force in the defense of himself and others in the shooting of Charles Smith. The general presentment was given to the presiding Superior Court Judge, Judge James Bass. It was then filed with the Superior Court Clerk's office. I'm going to list several but not all the conclusions of the grand jury. The grand jury found the physical evidence obtained supported the following conclusions. Mr. Smith had a gun after kicking out the glass of the police car and exiting the police car. This is based on DNA of Mr. Smith's found on the grip and the magazine of the gun found next to him at the scene. Evidence showed Mr. Smith, who was handcuffed from behind, moved them to the front of his body while in the police car. Officer Jannot was the only officer who fired his weapon during this incident. This is based on the rounds present in the weapons of all the officers, testing done of the weapons, and the number and the positioning of the spent shell casings. Only one officer was present in each of the two marked police cars at the scene on Augusta Avenue. The grand jury found that Officer Jannot's account of the incident was most credible. Physical evidence showed that Mr. Smith was under the influence of marijuana, cocaine, and bath salts at the time of the incident. The grand jury found that citizens, eyewitnesses failed to testify. However, their audio recorded statements were played. However, most of those statements directly contradicted the physical evidence presented. The grand jury expressed their concerns and beliefs that certain procedures concerning law enforcement should be changed. And finally, the grand jury expressed their concerns about the gun violence in Savannah and the number of convicted felons who are released from prison only to be arrested for new crimes while illegally carrying or using firearms. That was the total presentment of the grand jury, and it is not all of it, and as we gave you copies, it lists other concerns or evidence that they found. If you have any questions, we will take them at this time.
Where is this going to go next? Are you going to agree with the grand jury's decision? Is this going to go to a second grand jury? Can you explain that, please?
Sure. We presented this to the grand jury, and they exercised their civil powers. When they are sworn in, they are impaneled by Judge Bass, the Superior Court judge. When they're sworn in, they are instructed that they have criminal powers to stand over and review indictments. They also have civil powers. In this instance, 8 or more of the grand jurors called for an investigation of the force that was used on September 18th 2014. They have made their decision. They've listed, we put all the witnesses up there that were available. Over 45 witnesses testified. We are going to follow their decision that justifiable force was used and no further criminal action should be taken against Officer Jannot. Any other questions? Yes.
Well, I could probably sit here for a while. Not having read through all this, and apologies for that, just haven't gotten it. Is it possible? I mean, I think there's still so many questions about exactly what happened here, what the testimony was, particularly about how Mr. Smith had a gun when he was handcuffed and placed in a patrol car. Is there any way you can kind of walk us through what the evidence and the testimony showed, kind of the narrative or the timeline of it?
Well, and as if you look to the general presentment, testimony was presented that witnesses on the scene, both law enforcement and civilians saw Mr. Smith kick out the window, and they also saw him with a gun. There was also forensic testimony by stating that his DNA was found on the weapon at the scene.
So is the conclusion that he had a weapon concealed on him that they didn't catch before they put him in the patrol car?
You know, the evidence was that he was arrested. 30 seconds later, the incident occurred, and the weapon was found near him, and that his DNA was all over the weapon. That's the testimony that was presented to the grand jury. And there were civilian witnesses as well as law enforcement who saw a weapon in his hand as he was coming out the window.
So we don't know where that gun came from?
You know, I would again tell you that all the evidence, the open records request, and I would say that you could look to the evidence and the investigation done by the GBI.
What about the pat-down that was done out there? They said they couldn't find one, or they never found one, or are you saying at this point from the evidence that the pat-down was not done correctly to find that?
No, what I would say is that a pat-down was done and that officers testified that they did not find a weapon. Within 30 seconds, a weapon with Mr. Smith's DNA was found at the scene where the incident occurred.
Is there any sense of where that gun came from, that where on his body he might have had it? Because obviously it's not the easiest thing to hide necessarily.
Testimony was given that he was arrested, that there was a struggle, that they had concerns of the situation escalating, that they were trying to move him to the precinct, and that's what the evidence was shown, and the recordings, the 911, the radio recordings for law enforcement, that they were moving him to the precinct, and then they would settle it then. I think their concern was to get out of the area quickly. A pat-down was done, but subsequently the weapon was found.
Is there any sense that that officer who did the pat-down should face any disciplinary action or anything of that sort?
That is out of my realm. That is with the Savannah-Chatham Metropolitan Police Department.
Could we get any information as to the demographics of the grand jury, the racial makeup, the gender, that sort of thing?
I would actually have to go back. Again, I would just say this is a grand jury that was impaneled by Judge James Bass. Mm-hmm. I would have to go and look. I don't have that information.
All right, thank you.
How many eyewitnesses were we talking about that didn't respond to the subpoenas?
I believe we had 5 eyewitnesses. 1 did show. I believe 2 avoided subpoena, and the 3 failed to come and give their testimony. However, in the position that we wanted to be transparent as possible, we went ahead and played the statements that they made either to the GBI. Some did not make statements to the GBI. Some refused to speak with the GBI, but did give statements to the Smith family. We received those statements via email. They were not dated. We didn't know who was in the room, but we went ahead and played them and let the grand jury make their decision.
Is that normal process in that case for something like this?
No, it is not. Normally, we want to meet with the witnesses, we want to talk to them, and normally that evidence would not be admissible at trial. However, because we wanted to be as transparent as possible, we went ahead and played them.
You went with a little bit of a different grand jury procedure this time around. Can you talk about that a little bit more, and what we're seeing here? How much more detail is this than we would normally see in this kind of situation?
Well, as the district attorney, you have several choices. I could review the file and make a decision. I've been a prosecutor for over 20 years. I could present an indictment and go before a grand jury and say, you know, should this case be true billed or should this case be no billed? Usually you do it with 1 witness. This way we did it is for transparency because of what has happened across the United States. And putting up 45 witnesses, I mean, the grand jury, it was long, long days for them. I think that's unheard of. We wanted to go to the extra mile. Any evidence we had, the good, the bad, the ugly, we wanted the grand jury to hear it. We wanted them to then deliberate and make a decision and issue a presentment of did they believe that a criminal indictment should have been called or asked for, or did they believe no further action should be taken?
Grand jury seems to, just from a cursory look, really hold the police to task for the way they handled the arrest itself and the immediate afterwards. Can you explain, can you talk a little bit about that for us?
I can't. Again, you know, we presented the evidence and then we stepped out. This was a presentment totally created by the grand jury, independent of us. And, you know, I can speak to their decision not to, that believe the officers' actions were justifiable. As to what they believe are policy procedures, that's something that the police departments would have to deal with.
What would you have to tell the people out there who, there has been so much controversy surrounding this, and there are a lot of people who still, you know, look before getting a chance to read everything, may believe otherwise about this shooting? What would you have to tell them now that this grand jury, the grand jury has come back with their decision?
The first thing I would say is that we went to every extent we could to put everybody up here who had any information. Even witnesses who failed to show, we still put their evidence out there. I know that there had been rumors and innuendos of potentially a second shooter, 2 officers. The GBI, we would reach out to the GBI and they'd say, this is a witness they said was involved in the shooting. The GBI would then go and track it down and investigate it and find that there was no merit to it. The grand jury listened to all the evidence, all the tapes, and found that the most credible testimony was Officer Jannot. They found that the physical evidence, the shell casings, the DNA, corroborated the story of what Officer Jannot stated happened. And Officer Jannot said he was the person who fired the shots because he had fear for another officer being harmed and himself.
From a GBI perspective, how many man-hours did you guys put into this, and how deep was this investigation?
Timeless man-hours that is uncounted at this time. Exactly how many hours it would be, but it was a long investigation, thoroughly looked into by the agents at my office.
Yes, ma'am.
The issue of the second shooter, I fear now that this is become public. I've spoken to a witness who was called but ultimately did not testify before this grand jury, about seeing a second officer there. My understanding is that there was a second officer present, perhaps even with his weapon unholstered. How do we know that that second officer was not involved in this? He did not fire?
Because the GBI investigated all weapons. The weapon, Officer Jannot's weapon, was taken to the crime lab. It was examined, and the forensic firearms expert testified that the shell casings found on the scene matched the weapon that was used in the shooting, and that was Officer Jannot's.
What was the racial makeup of this grand jury?
I don't have that information. You know, and I keep saying, and I want to make sure everybody understands, this grand jury was impaneled by a Superior Court judge. I have no say in who was picked for a grand jury.
Was the decision unanimous?
That I don't know. They deliberated. We were not a part of it. I can say it was a cohesive group. They worked quite well together.
So after this, you do not, I know you have the option, if you wanted to still draw up a bill of indictment. You do not plan to do that?
I do not. I believe that 45 witnesses were presented to this grand jury. An investigation with documents over 2,500. I believe that the actions, the grand jury heard everything, even the witnesses who failed to show. We still played their recordings, their taped statements. I believe the decision that the grand jury made should lay this to rest.
Okay.
However, Officer Jannot could potentially, if another district attorney is elected, could be charged.
Anyone could, unless you have a statute of limitations issues.
Okay, I think we're done.
We are, really?
One last question.
Well, I mean, again, I think there's some details here, and again, apologies, I know this was a long investigation, a long report, but we didn't have much of an idea before this exactly what transpired. It says here, Smith moving his handcuffed hands from behind his back, a fact supported by video evidence to the front of his body. Was there video from the patrol car or somewhere else that actually showed that happened?
No, I believe what they meant is that there was video evidence that the hands were behind his back.
When he was placed in the car, okay.
Right, and there's civilian testimony and also law enforcement testimony that they saw him after he kicked out the car with his hands in front of him with a weapon.
And he actually, he was shot after exiting the car, is that correct?
The physical evidence that the grand jury heard, yes, concludes or corroborates that.
And it says here he was shot 5 times?
That is correct.
Okay. Do we know?
That is through the pathologist. Dr. Donahue testified.
Do we know where he was shot? I mean, 5 times, I know was a lot in the front.
And I would say with that is the open records request. You get I don't want to give you a piece and parcel because there were so many witnesses. 45 witnesses testified to testimony. The forensic toxicologist, a firearms expert, a pathologist, law enforcement, civilians. And again, if they failed to show, we still played their testimony.
Okay.
In light of everything that's been going on around the nation, it was a very good decision by Savannah Chatham Metropolitan Police Department chief at that time and command staff to involve the Georgia Bureau of Investigation in the investigation to have an independent look into the situation. So just wanted to give credit to the police department for reaching out to us at the beginning.
How many more tools do you guys have than, say, the Savannah Department or any department right now to use in an investigation like this to make sure you get all the evidence?
We have resources throughout the state of Georgia. So not only do we have the Region 5 GBI office, if we need additional manpower, we have the ability to be able to call agents throughout the entire state.
In addition, it also gives an appearance of propriety that you have an independent agency. You know, they don't have an axe to grind in this case. Is what their job is to gather the evidence and present it to us. They're not involved with the police department other than the investigation.
I will say that it's sad when anybody loses their life, so condolences go out to the Smith family, and also at the same time, sometimes when law enforcement is put in these positions, no one thinks about the police officer, so condolences also goes out to the police officer, Officer Jannot, and his family, because he's undergone a lot throughout this investigation. So I'd like to ask for the community to step up and support law enforcement, and let's work together as a team.